Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The company he wanted was on the street. William Gladstone was the first to leave dinner at the Clarendon Hotel, turning his back on Foreign Secretary Henry Temple, the third Viscount of Palmerston, and the US Ambassador in London, Abbot Lawrence. Turning down New Bond Street in London, Gladstone began looking for the sex worker Elizabeth Collins, a most lovely statue he had written in his private diaries in Italian. 2 more hours, strange, questionable. His entry for that summer night in 1851 reads. Following the words, the soon-to-be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Gladstone drew a small picture of a whip. Torn by guilt over his sexual desires, biographer Roy Jenkins has recorded, Gladstone would flagellate himself. As former United States President Donald Trump confronts the prospect of years in prison, the story of the great 19th century liberal leader reminds us that, barring its very public performance, there is little unusual about his conduct. Trump's misogyny and his execrable sexual politics are part of the warp and weft of America's deeply Christian ideological character, woven from guilt and shame. There can be more than one opinion, Eric Levitz notes, on whether Trump's payoffs to former porn star Stephanie Clifford, aka Stormy Daniels, should have ended up in criminal court or not. However, there can be only one opinion about the educational merits of these kinds of scandals. Great men, these scandals teach us, are driven by all sorts of unexamined neuroses, sexual anxieties, and self-delusions, just like all other men. All leaders and their ethical claims therefore need to be subjected to constant skeptical scrutiny by their voters. 3 women had accused John Cotton Jr., a popular newly married cleric and son of a great pillar of New England's Puritan theocratic establishment, of sexual misconduct. One had alleged that Cotton talked his way into her bedroom by feigning an interest in her furniture, and another of what she called sinful striving. 2 judges and 2 clerics had been summoned in the 17th century to investigate the charges. In response, Cotton stood before this eminent panel and compared himself to the biblical Joseph and his accusers to Potiphar's wife. She, he said, had relentlessly pursued him. Even though the trial could arrive at no firm conclusion, the young cleric was expelled from his congregation, the First Church of Boston, in 1664, for lascivious, unclean practices with 3 women and his horrid lying to hide his sin. He then confessed to his guilt in public and was forgiven, and began a long, stellar career as a preacher. The point of this story is pretty simple. From its founding moments, the Republic of God, set up by Protestant fundamentalists who emigrated from Europe to the New World, confronted tensions between their moral principles and human nature. The Lord might have had no patience with sodomy and bestiality, but the young male population of the colonies was not always mindful of his commands. Late in 1789 in colonial America, historian John Murin has recorded that a soldier, unironically named Sparrow, the tallest, straightest, and cleanest grenadier in the whole regiment, according to one account, was tried for having sex with a turkey, and that in full dress uniform. The 13-year-old girl who saw this unusual spectacle was too young to be called as a witness. But the bloody turkey, I'll leave the rest to your imagination, served as adequate evidence. The turkey was plucked and its feathers pasted onto the soldier's body as he was marched out of the town. What happened to the bird, I can't say. Even the most pious citizens of the colonies, historians Susan Juster and Ellen Harrington O'Connor have written, struggled with their forbidden desires. The diaries of the 19th century Baptist preacher William Babcock show he was tormented by hateful, obscene ideas which went on in his head and vexed with the flesh. There was one occasion when, while preaching, he stopped and walked to the opposite side of the room and kissed a woman. To the irate congregation, he explained that, I quote, the woman desired it, though she didn't know it, and I felt it my duty to gratify her. French brothels in the 19th century, literature scholar Colleen Lamos reminds us, were familiar with men like Prime Minister Gladstone. The English predilection for whipping led it to be labelled le vice anglais, or the English vice. Victorian England, which inherited Gladstone's cultural milieu, was awash in flagellant pornography, and contemporary journalists sometimes lamented the prevalence of the practice among elites. Likely, this practice had something to do with the trauma unleashed by the frequent public school use of the whip as a teaching tool. To his friends and confidants and to his own diary, Gladstone confided that he met sex workers to proselytize them and bring them back to God's path. The project, by his own account, had no success, but for some reason he kept at it very earnestly, provoking sniggers among his contemporaries. The diaries leave little doubt that his missionary project was suffused with unacknowledged erotic longing. British statesman Edmund Burke's attack on the East India Company, historian Durba Ghosh has recorded, was enabled by fears that the English moral order was threatened by miscegenation and the adoption of non-English cultural mores by white men in colonial India. The maintenance of the order demanded the crushing of such transgressions and therefore direct crown rule. American political history was also suffused with the same tensions and similar figures. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, arguably the most brilliant of America's founding fathers, had an affair with his secretary, Marie Reynolds, in 1791-1792. Like Trump, Hamilton made several payoffs to Reynolds, who his biographer Richard Brookhiser describes as, and I quote, a blackmailer and other derogatory names. The exposure of the affair played a role in ensuring Hamilton never became president, despite his amazing competence and skill. Two strategies emerged for dealing with sex scandals. Thomas Jefferson, who became US President in 1801, rose to the top by stoically ignoring claims that he had a relationship and children with a teenage slave, Sally Hemings. For a century and a half, historians dismissed the allegation as scurrilous until that unfortunate thing called DNA evidence settled the story, and not in the president's favor. Grover Cleveland, the two-time US president who confessed to fathering an illegitimate child in 1884, was quickly forgiven by the public, though. As historian Howard Wayne Morgan has noted, many had assumed the president's political career would not withstand the crisis. The decision to tell the truth, though, redeemed him. President Warren G. Harding was rumored to have had several mistresses, including one who took $20,000 in hush money and another who bore his child. The news of the affairs, though, only emerged after his death, together with evidence of other large-scale corruption. It's a good thing I'm not a woman, he once told the press. I would always be pregnant. I can't say no. The 32nd United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt's affair with Lucy Mercer never became public. Neither did President John F. Kennedy's legendary sexual appetites, which were kept quiet by a largely pliant White House press. And just like Cleveland and the preacher Cotton, Bill Clinton was eventually pardoned by the public after humiliating public, would we call it self-flagellation? Washington, as the political scientist Alison Dagners has noted in a brilliant book, Sex Scandals in American Politics, has long been a kind of Hollywood for ugly people. Predation, exploitation, and sleaze are enmeshed with success and power. Elliot Spitzer, the square-jawed, upright governor of New York who had promised to bring morals back to public life, was implicated in a prostitution ring in 2008. Larry Craig, A prominent right-wing senator was caught attempting to solicit a male sex worker in an airport toilet in 2007. There are dozens of similar cases which Google should be able to guide you through. And they shouldn't surprise us. The scandals of the film star or the sports icon aren't very different. Elsewhere in the world, religion and sex arrived at a more accommodating relationship. In 11th century Rome, physician William Sanger notes, a brothel stood next to a cathedral, while Pope Clement sought to earn taxes from prostitutes. In Islamic Turkey, homosexuality was legally proscribed, but enforcement was lax to non existent. The philosopher A.C. Grayling uh, once famously noted that Anglo Saxon culture moved sex from its proper place as a natural part of human behavior to the domain of the forbidden, of vice. Environments in which religion and morals play a moral role, Grayling argues, such as politics, became a site of neurosis. Few cultures outside the United States and the United Kingdom expect their leaders to uphold moral values that society itself is unwilling to practice. The personal lives of the presidents of France or prime ministers of India are largely ignored by the public. Though concerns about sex, fidelity, and family run deep in all cultures, political leaders are not expected to be moral exemplars. That job is left for saints. Trump's dogged denial of wrongdoing in the face of all the evidence might eventually retrieve his standing among his congregation. Perhaps a future Clinton like confession will do that for him instead. The lesson the world ought to be learning, though, is that the crimes he's being punished for are the failings of his people and their culture. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of Security Code.